Good to see you.
Great stuff.
Just ready to find. Thank you. Okay. There's a further bit up there.
I'll wander up later. I'll wander up later, Gordon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where
names are on
the
the
prison
wall,
was. That's where the prison was.
Ah,
That's where, right?
It was not good to build the railway, you know, the railway's underneath there.
That's freedom fighters.
That's corporate vandalism.
Apparently.
There was an arch there.
Yeah.
And that, I can remember that being there.
There's a
Somebody's in.
Riverview Players memorial for the 60 who died in the Massacre of Cathcart Street.
Absolutely.
The only thing that's
Kids.
still from
Basically.
prison is that wall. See the wall there? That's part of it, yeah.
I believe Kenny's coming to do a speech down here shortly at the memorial. Which is here. This is what happens when you make protesting illegal. And this is no 1820. This is 2021, 201 years later. And they're now going to use Westminster to ban us for protesting outside their own parliament. This is what happens when you ban protests. Anyway, as I say, Kenny's going to have a word about it just now. So.
Keep telling you that the we decided
she also done
Very good.
down at
No joke, I'm not on stage today, but my resolution's going to be the first one after dinner as far as I know. David Henry's going to be speaking and Michelle Fern's going to be second.
Any of your committee want to come in the picture? Ian, do you want to come in the picture? Any committee want to come in? Any committee want to come in the picture?
right, come in.
Yes, all right.
This is thrown away. Ian, can you get a bit closer, please? And
Don't
that way.
cover a monument.
let's don't cover the sign. Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
People over statues.
And one more. Thank you.
Protect their statues. Well, I just want to say thanks to all those involved in the 1820 Society. It's actually been a privilege to come here and see this. I've researched it, but I've only driven past here. It is about preserving the memory, I think. One of the great tragedies in Scotland is we don't realise just how important the 1820 Rising was. I always thought researching it, the best description came from Tom Johnson in his book The Making of the Scottish Working Class, when he said it was an insurrection from which it was hoped a revolution would spring. And now it went off, sadly, rather a bit half-cocked, you might say. The sign of a rising in England didn't come. For whatever reason, it appeared some either didn't get notification that the notification hadn't come. Others just probably decided that they had prepared for it and they were going to go for it and go for it. They did, and shootouts in Paisley, I always remember it quite strange. All these places that I now view as housing schemes were actually farmhouses where gunfights took place because the landowners had the weapons, and it ties in with why people were marching on Carron. The march on Carron had a logic, not that they were heading to the sea, but they were heading to Carron Ironworks, where you could actually access weaponry that would allow you to confront the British Armed Forces. That was why they marched on Carron. That was the logic of that. But it is important, I think, first of all, of remembering the memory, which is right, and I was actually delighted to actually see the names, and I'll photograph and keep that for posterity. We owe it to those who sacrificed their lives to actually remember them and revere them centuries after their passing. But it's also about recalling our history, and that's what I came across when I was actually privileged to go and research that book. We are denied our own history. I now represent East Lothian, I've given talks in East Lothian about the massacre of Tranent. I grew up less than 40 miles from Tranent, and I briefly had heard of the massacre of Tranent, but I didn't really know about it. I was told at school, rightly so, about the massacre at Peterloo, but nobody told me about the massacre of Tranent, and in fact it was inextricably linked, because what took place in the 1790s actually resulted in the 1820 rising. When you track who was involved, you see that people actually who had been involved in the risings actually had to duck down. Some had been transported, others just kept their counsel until the landscape changed. And it's important that we do remember our own history, because I still remember being taught both a false history of Culloden, where I was told it was a civil war, until I managed to read Murray Pittock's book and realise that actually more Spanish and Irish fought with Bonnie Prince Charlie than Scots fought with the Duke of Cumberland. And whilst there was a civil war in parts, let's be quite clear, Culloden was the Hanoverian forces, many of whom, if they weren't English, were German, versus Scottish, and it wasn't even Highland clans, the majority were actually Lowland or non-Highland. So the whole imagery that would be painted of wild men with claymores, actually it was a much more just a mismatched odds. So it is about remembering all those things, because Tranent actually has a link with 1820, because the military commander of the British forces, who was in overall responsibility for what happened in Tranent, was the Earl of Liverpool, who by 1820 was the Prime Minister of Britain and was ultimately responsible for the actions that took place and the hanging and beheading of Baird Hardy Wilson and the transportation of the others to Australia. So it is, as I say, that link all stands in and ties there. But they have tried to, rate our history. I actually came about and I told them, I know Gordon's gone through to look at the obelisk, but I hadn't realised the history of the obelisk that stands to the Martyrs' Memorial, not the martyrs of 1820, but the ones in 1794, the Friends of the People who were transported. That went back to the 1820s. The new town of Edinburgh was being built. The pride of the Hanoverians was being laid out. George had come and been celebrated. Walter Scott was writing about it. The mythology of the kilt was being created as they tried to show that they really were good, caring Scottish people and had a link. And actually they started naming the streets, Princess Street, George Street, on Frederick Street. And their statues were going up, and there are statues there today to the Duke of Wellington, to Admiral Nelson or whatever. And the people, the radicals said, where's our history? This isn't our history. We want the history of our people recorded. You've got Dundas' statue, and I was saying earlier, people have been criticising that because of his actions in slavery, and for that he stands condemned. But what about his actions against the people of Scotland? Because he was the one that brought in despotism. He was the one that actually built military camps. Because what's never been told and never taught in schools, I had heard how they built forts, such as Fort George, such as indeed Fort William, Fort Augustus in the north. But in the 1790s, because they were worried about the rising radicals, they started constructing camps all across central Scotland. They built one that I used to have the privilege of representing in East Edinburgh in Pearse Hill. The Pearse Hill Barracks started out. Glasgow was built, Ayr was built, Hamilton was built, Perth was built. Why were they built? Because exactly the same as in the north, they were the arterial routes, and that gave you control because we were worried that an insurrection was coming in central Scotland that might be matched by a rising in the Highlands, and they built to suppress our people. Some of it was masked on the basis that because of the Napoleonic Wars, they actually couldn't keep soldiers who previously were either billeted in castles or barracks, or indeed billeted in people. But they realised that one, they couldn't billet it with the people because the people were actually getting them to come out of the army because the army was not popular. This mythology that I have created, that Scots were almost born for generations to join the British army and go and fight in foreign wars and foreign lands. People didn't like the army. They came into your communities, they took your sons who you needed to work either in your fields or lands or just to pay for the household. So there was a denigration of the army at that stage, and understandably so, because they were an inconvenience upon communities. So all that history we have been denied us, which is why it's important that we fight back and write that. Because I always remember, and I think I had a friend in Ireland who's actually originally Scottish, but he always said, oh, the difference he said in Ireland is, every generation had its rising. And it's true, they did, and I even much of the radicalism in Scotland after 1798 came from people who came from Ireland and formed the United Scotsmen, which is why, you know, we wish to have George Mulemaker added to the list of names at the obelisk through in Glasgow. But that all that has transformed and you know, moved on. So we have to remember our martyr dead. Sorry, I just kind of lost my place here. Something else came into mind. Let me briefly mention Mulemaker. I feel really sorry for Mulemaker, and that's why Gordon and I have been lobbying Edinburgh Council to try and get Mulemaker added to the obelisk. Mulemaker actually gave evidence that would have exculpated Fish Palmer. Fish Palmer, who is one of the martyrs, Mulemaker actually wrote the document that Fish Palmer was convicted, and well, not convicted, having been charged with. Mulemaker gave evidence that he had written it. He had given it to Fish Palmer, who was a minister, to revise, because Mulemaker was a humble waiver. But the prosecution, Dundas and his nephew, actually probably thought that Mulemaker was just a weaver. What would he know? Fish Palmer was a minister and an educated man. Some of it would be that he was a traitor to his class. Some of it would be, what would a humble weaver know? Well, they would find out in the 1820s what humble weavers could do and organise. But Mulemaker was viewed as being the leader of the United Scotsmen. He faced, you know, jail at one stage and managed to get off a trial rather strangely, I think. They didn't get the evidence. But eventually he was transported in 1798. He died a rather slow, cruel death. He didn't cope with transportation, probably because of the background of separation from his family that didn't apply to the likes of Margaret, who had more money and assets and could bring their family out. And he deserves to be recalled. So I think Mulemaker's name should be added to that statue, that obelisk through in Glasgow. But as I say, the difficulties, I'm glad to see the council put this up here, because the obelisk in Edinburgh was originally planned was to put it on Carlton Hill, and the Tory councils that won then refused to countenance having the obelisk in Carlton Hill. The reason they put it on Carlton Hill, it was invisible to everybody around. They eventually were told by the council they weren't getting it, so they managed to acquire land at the Carlton Cemetery, and some leading Tory councillors sought to litigate on the basis that it would disturb with the peace of the dead. So outraged were they that the martyrs would be recognised there. Thankfully that was thrown out, and the obelisk stands there, and it isn't as visible as it would be from Carlton Hill, but it is still visible. It ties in with 1820, because there wouldn't have been an 1820 rising, in my view, if there hadn't been the uprising, both the 1794, the Friends of the People, if there hadn't been the United Scotsmen, if there hadn't been those who had been prepared to suffer, and that's why it's our duty to recall. It took until the 1840s before they finally got the obelisk constructed, but constructed it was, and that's why, as I say, I welcome this here. Equally, there's something shameful that kids in schools, whether in Greenock, whether in Lithgow where I grew up, whether in Trinent, still don't know the history of their people. They don't know about the Massacre Trinent. They don't know about what took place here in Greenock. They don't know about the radical rising when our people said enough is enough. It was meant to have been a pan-UK rising. There were in fact gunfights in areas of Yorkshire as people there took to the streets, but their leadership had been taken out with the Cato Street conspiracy as the security forces, if we can call them that, had been involved in closing it down. That's why, you know, the actions of the 1820 Society that I have known for a long, long time are to be commended, because sadly we have not, as you'll know, we've made progress in the Scottish educational syllabus. There's still a hell of a long way to go, and that's why keeping it alive at grassroots is what matters. So more power to the elbow of Ian, Gordon and all of you here. Thanks for what you do. We are rightly revering our martyr dead. We're recalling their history, because it's only by knowing your history that you understand who you are, understand what you're fighting for, and indeed that is what will drive us on. Ultimately, as they were fighting, the same as us, we will make Scotland that nation once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. As chairman of the 1820 Society, I thank Kenny for his wonderful oration there. And yes, we should recall the martyrs. This was the copy of the banner that they carried in 1820, Baird, Hardy and Wilson. And I want to point out the vicious and cruel death that they got. simply because they were asking for three things. The right to vote. They wanted to vote, they wanted the right to form unions, and of course the third thing, which really annoyed the British authorities, they wanted a provisional Scottish government. And it was they sacrificed their lives, because not only did they hang them, it was the old method of hanging where they actually pulled you up on a rope and you dangled about there for a while, choking to death, and then they cut you down and they actually beheaded them. 1820 is not a long time ago, a couple of hundred years ago. It's only 200, just over 200 years. I mean, I was at a man's funeral 2 years ago who lived to 106. So it just shows you that when he was born, it was only a few years previous. This area here is where the prison was, that there were 6 political prisoners put there, and the Greenock crowd went up here, and just about halfway up the road there, on the right hand side was the prison. It was knocked down to build the railway, which is tunnel is under this road. This was a church beside the prison where they marched certain people out to the square to be executed, etc. That's how old that kirk is. But the doorway to that prison was there until 1970, and it was demolished by the stupid, rather ignorant town council. But you can't blame them, because they were never taught in school. My school was only just over the hill there, and I was taught about the storming of the Bastille. I was taught that at the French Revolution, storming the Bastille, and it was only a few hundred yards from a proper storming of a prison to release political prisoners. Because the Bastille was a piece of French propaganda, because the Bastille, the reason they stormed it in France was because it had gunpowder and ammunition and weapons. Because there was only 3 prisoners, and one was an Irish guy that had been caught for being drunk and disorderly. and that was your storming of the Bastille. But they put it that it was to storm to let the poor wretches go that was in there. This was a genuine storming of a prison, in the sense, in fact, I believe that one of the stories goes that the turnkeys or the jailers didn't offer the keys to the people, and they released the prisoners, and only 1 out of the 6 was ever recaptured. But they were radicals who were released. The crowd then marched down here, turned right, and just along there you'll find the James Watt Bar. It was actually the original Tontine Hotel. This is where the militia fired into the crowd, and you'll see the names on the wall up there, all the people that they killed. One was only a little boy of 8, called McGill, and the oldest was a man of 65. So, and 65 was an old man in those days. This is a struggle which the people obtained. We've since obtained it. Those men sacrificed their life, and we now have not 100% a nation again, but we do have the starts of it. We've got the vote, and we've got the forming of unions. We've got what you could call a provisional Scottish Parliament. And this man was one of the people that sat in it. And I want to mention something more modern. I will never stop thanking this man, when he was Minister of Justice, for releasing the so-called terrorist who was in the Greenock prison. Because if he hadn't done so, we would have, if that man had died, we would have had egg in our face, because it's now been proven that if he was even involved in the thing at all, that they've got the wrong man. Nevertheless, retaliatory bombs would have went off in this town if he had died in that prison, because that's the first. Because after all, Lockerbie itself was a retaliation for the Iranian airliner that was shot down a couple of years before that. So thank you, Kenny, for your research that you did and the fact that democracy and your goodwill, and you went all the way and you actually spoke and released the man, but only after you were totally convinced that he was not the right man.
Against much political pressure for the UK government and the US government, a lot of pressure on that man's shoulders.
Yes, I think someday it'll maybe all come out in the wash, but nevertheless, I think this man's he'll go down in history, that's for sure, for being a wonderful Scot and a patriot. And thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.